There is a force that some people emit that is so powerful, it bends reality around them. A light so blinding that it casts deep and terrifying shadows, where truth and illusion dance together. What if behind the greatest entertainer the world has ever known, there was a complex web of fear, trauma, and a dark genius for dealing with a pressure that would crush any one of us? Welcome to The Truth, Dark Psychology. Today, we dissect the mind of a king. If you seek to understand the hidden layers of the human psyche, subscribe, like the video, and prepare yourself for what we are about to reveal. The foundation of any psyche, whether brilliant or disturbed, is built in childhood. For the future king of pop, this foundation was cracked with the most intense of hammers, a father's relentless ambition and the total loss of normalcy. What we see as the birth of a prodigy was, in fact, a rigorous conditioning program. The music, the dance, the flawless performance were not just art. They were survival mechanisms. Each dance step was a way to dodge a blow. Each note sung was a cry for an approval that was always tied to fear, creating a permanent, neurological association between success and suffering. This environment of high pressure and constant physical and emotional abuse is the fertile ground for what dark psychology calls a fracture of the identity. The child learns that their true self is not valuable. Only the performing persona is worthy of love, or at least of a truce from the pain. This forces the creation of a mask, a separate entity that can bear the weight of the world. Michael, the artist, was born not just from talent, but from the desperate need of Michael, the boy, to hide in a safe place. The genius the world applauded was, in its essence, the armor of a terrified child. The consequence of a stolen childhood is a lifelong search for what was denied. The obsession with control, which would become a hallmark of his career and personal life, began here. When a child has no control over their own body, their routine, or their safety, they grow up with a pathological need to control every aspect of their adult environment. This is not a simple preference for order. It is a defense mechanism to ensure that the helplessness and terror of childhood never return, an impulse that would lead him to build entire worlds to protect himself. Unresolved trauma manifests in treacherous ways. It hides behind the smile, drives ambition, and poisons relationships. Michael Jackson's relentless pursuit of perfection was not just professionalism. It was the echo of his father's voice in his mind, the internalized belief that any mistake, no matter how small, would result in punishment and rejection. This perfectionist mindset is a psychological prison, where success never brings peace, only a temporary relief from anxiety before the cycle begins again. It is the engine of a genius, but an engine that burns the soul itself as fuel. Therefore, when analyzing the complex figure he became, it is impossible to ignore the forge of his early years. The pressure did not begin with global fame. It was the atmosphere he breathed from day one. The fear was not just of the paparazzi or the accusations. It was a fundamental fear etched into his nervous system. Understanding this origin is not to justify, but to contextualize the dark psychology he had to employ, first to survive his family, and then to survive the world. Michael Jackson's face became one of the most debated canvases in modern history. But to reduce his transformations to mere vanity is to ignore the profound psychological war that was happening behind his eyes. When the image you see in the mirror is intrinsically linked to a past of pain, abuse, and an identity you despise, the desire to alter it becomes a matter of psychological survival. Plastic surgery, in this context, ceases to be aesthetic and becomes a desperate attempt to kill the old self, to physically erase the child who could not defend himself. Psychology tells us about body dysmorphic disorder, a condition where a person has an obsessive preoccupation with a perceived flaw in their appearance. In Michael's case, this was amplified by decades of trauma. The features he inherited from his father were a constant reminder of his tormentor. Every look in, the mirror reflected not just himself, but also the man who terrorized him. The gradual destruction of his original face can be interpreted as a symbolic act of parricide, an attempt to eliminate any trace of his creator from his own existence, seeking a blank canvas on which to project a new identity. This search for a new face is an external manifestation of a need for absolute control over one's own narrative. If he couldn't change his past, perhaps he could at least completely control his presentation to the world. The lightened skin, the thinned nose, the cleft chin, each change was a step away from Michael Joseph Jackson of Gary, Indiana, and a step toward Michael Jackson, the entity, the brand, the myth. It was a form of self-manipulation before. It was a manipulation of the public, an attempt to build on the outside the untouchable persona he wished to be on the inside. The danger of this strategy is that it is never enough. The dissatisfaction that fuels dysmorphia does not reside in the skin, but in the soul. Each surgical procedure offered temporary relief, a brief sense of control, before the anxiety and self-hatred returned, focusing on a new flaw. It is a vicious and self-destructive cycle, where the pursuit of external perfection only deepens the internal void. The world watched, fascinated and horrified, not realizing it was witnessing the visible symptoms of an invisible and relentless psychological agony. In the end, Michael Jackson's ever-changing face became the perfect metaphor for his fragmented psyche. It was not one face, but a collage of identities, fears, and desires. It was the face of a scared boy, a musical genius, a charismatic showman, and a tortured soul, all superimposed on a canvas of flesh and bone. The mirror wasn't broken. What was broken was the man looking into it, desperate to assemble his pieces into an image he could finally love, or at least endure. Neverland. The name alone evokes a fantasy of eternal innocence and escape from the responsibilities of the adult world. To the public, it was the eccentricity of a wealthy genius, a private amusement park. But from the perspective of dark psychology, the construction of Neverland was an act of environmental control without precedent. It was the creation of a sovereign bubble, a kingdom where Michael Jackson was not just the king, but the god. He dictated the rules, the atmosphere, and reality itself, power that was denied to him throughout his childhood. The genius of Neverland lies in its power to disarm. Adults, journalists, celebrities, and children entered a world designed to dissolve cynicism and induce a state of childlike wonder. With carousels, movie theaters, and free candy, the psychological resistance of visitors was systematically weakened. In this state of induced regression, people become more suggestible, more open, and less critical. The question that dark psychology forces us to ask is, was this a genuine attempt to share joy, or a manipulative strategy to neutralize threats and exert emotional control? Within the gates of his ranch, Michael created a power dynamic where he was the guardian of fantasy and happiness. This gave him an almost magical aura, that of a benevolent Peter Pan who just wanted to play. However, this same dynamic isolates and creates dependency. By positioning himself as the sole source of a perfect world, he could mirror the purity and innocence of children, reinforcing his own narrative of a lost childhood. It was a psychological echo chamber, where the image he wanted to project was constantly reflected back at him by those who were enchanted by his creation. Asterisk. The line between inspiration and manipulation here is dangerously thin. Building a sanctuary to heal one's own wounded inner child is one thing. Using that same sanctuary to attract real children to an isolated world, far from their normal contexts, raises complex ethical and psychological questions. The very nature of Neverland, as a place without the rules of the outside world, created a power vacuum where vulnerability could be exploited, whether intentionally or not. It was a paradise, but a paradise built and governed by a single, complex will, analyzing it coldly. Neverland was the physical manifestation of Michael Jackson's psyche, grandiose, fascinating, childlike, and at the same time, a meticulously designed control mechanism. It was his ultimate stage, where he not only performed, but directed the experience of everyone around him. A place to escape the pressure of the world, but also a laboratory to study and perfect the power of influence and charisma in a fully controlled environment, far from critical eyes. Neverland was real, but its purpose was perhaps much darker than a simple fairy tale. Michael Jackson's charisma transcended that of a mere pop star. He cultivated a messianic aura, a combination of ethereal vulnerability and almost divine power. On stage, this duality is an extremely potent tool of influence. By showing himself as fragile, shy, and misunderstood in interviews, he activated the public's protective instinct. However, on stage, he transformed into a figure of absolute power and control, hypnotizing crowds with almost military precision. This alternation created a fascinating cognitive dissonance, making people feel they needed to protect him and at the same time worship him. This messianic persona was reinforced by a carefully calculated mystery. The limited access, the rare appearances, the use of masks and gloves, all of this was not just a fashion statement, but a psychological strategy to create a sense of otherness. He was not like us. He was different, special, perhaps even touched by something supernatural. The psychology of persuasion teaches us that scarcity and mystery increase perceived value. By becoming an enigma, he became infinitely more valuable and desirable in the eyes of the public, who filled in the gaps with their own fantasies and projections. His body and visual language was a masterclass in mass manipulation. The crying on stage, the gesture of bringing his hands to his face in apparent emotional agony, the screams that seemed to come from a place of deep pain. These were powerful emotional triggers, designed to create an instant empathetic connection. With millions of people, he wasn't just singing a song. He was performing a public exorcism of his demons, and he invited everyone to participate in this ritual. This collective catharsis forged a bond of loyalty that went far beyond artistic admiration, bordering on religious devotion. This devotion created a powerful shield. When the accusations and controversies arose for his most loyal fans, it was unthinkable that such an angelic and suffering figure could be guilty of dark acts. The image of the misunderstood martyr, which he and his team actively promoted, worked as a psychological block against negative information. Any criticism was seen not as a legitimate accusation, but as another attack from a cruel world that did not understand its savior. This is a classic example of how the construction of a charismatic persona can inoculate a leader against criticism and reason. Messianic charisma, however, is a double-edged sword. It grants immense power, but it also isolates the individual on an unsustainable pedestal. The pressure to maintain this divine persona, to be everyone's savior, is overwhelming and dehumanizing. Michael Jackson, the man, became trapped inside Michael Jackson, the Messiah. He became a prisoner of his own creation, unable to show weakness or failure without the entire house of cards collapsing. The same charisma that connected him to millions of people disconnected him from his own humanity. If this analysis of the layers of the human psyche is resonating with you, take a quick pause and leave a like to support our work here at The Truth. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our future investigations. Comment below what other complex personality you would like us to analyze. Now let's get back to the darkness. Fame on a stratospheric level comes with an unavoidable side effect: paranoia. For Michael Jackson, this paranoia was exacerbated by his childhood experiences, where betrayal and exploitation came from those who were supposed to protect him. This created a mental model that the world was an inherently dangerous place, and that trust was a rare and dangerous currency. Isolation, therefore, was not just a preference, but a primary defense strategy. Reducing his inner circle was a way to minimize the variables, to limit the number of people who could potentially hurt or exploit him. This chronic distrust manifests as hypervigilance. Every word is analyzed, every gesture is questioned, every new acquaintance is first seen as a potential threat. Psychologically, this is exhausting. Living in a constant state of high alert drains mental and emotional resources, leading to a vicious cycle. Isolation increases paranoia, and paranoia justifies even greater isolation. Neverland again emerges as the perfect setting for this mindset, a fortress from which he could observe the world from a safe distance, controlling who came in and who went out. Dark psychology explores how paranoia can be used, paradoxically, as a tool of control. By keeping everyone at a distance and under suspicion, Michael Jackson forced the people in his circle to constantly prove their loyalty. This creates a power dynamic where others are always seeking his approval, afraid to make a wrong move. The paranoia, though genuine and debilitating for him, also became a mechanism for filtering and controlling his employees, collaborators, and even friends, ensuring that only the most submissive or dedicated remain nearby. The danger of this siege mentality is that it distorts the perception of reality. When you believe that everyone is conspiring against you, you begin to interpret neutral or even positive actions as part of a sinister plan. A journalist asking a tough question isn't doing their job, they're trying to destroy you. An employee who resigns isn't seeking a new opportunity, they're betraying you. This cognitive distortion trapped him in an alternate reality where he was the lone hero fighting against a world of villains, making honest feedback and genuine connection nearly impossible. In the end, the shield of paranoia became a cage. It protected him from some real threats, but it also isolated him from any possibility of a normal life and healthy relationships. The constant fear of betrayal ended up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing away people who might have helped him and attracting those who were skilled at navigating his world of distrust for their own gain. The wall he built to protect himself from the world also prevented him from being saved by it. One of the most sophisticated and controversial tactics in Michael Jackson's psychological arsenal was the strategic use of victimhood. In the face of criticism, accusations, or media scrutiny, the public narrative that his team and he himself constructed was consistently that of the misunderstood martyr. He wasn't an eccentric or a possible criminal. He was a pure, childlike soul being crucified by a cynical and predatory world. This narrative is incredibly powerful because it inverts the power dynamic, turning the accused into the victim and the accusers into aggressors. This strategy, known in dark psychology as playing the victim, serves multiple purposes. First, it generates an immense wave of public sympathy, activating the protective instinct that was already latent in his fan base. Second, it shifts the focus away from the accusations themselves and onto the alleged prejudice and cruelty of the media and the justice system. Instead of debating the facts of a case, the public begins to debate the fairness of the treatment he was receiving. It's a genius diversionary tactic, moving the battlefield to an emotional terrain where he had the advantage. It is crucial to understand that this victim posture was likely not entirely fabricated. Given his traumatic childhood and the surreal pressure of fame, he undoubtedly felt genuinely victimized and persecuted. The dark tactic lies not in the existence of the feeling, but in its instrumentalization. It is the ability to take a real and vulnerable emotion and turn it into a public relations and legal defense weapon. The interview with Martin Bashir is a classic example, where his fragility and Peter Pan narrative were displayed to the world, generating both pity and alarm, but above all, complicating any simple judgment about him. The danger of using victimhood as a weapon is that it can become an identity, By getting used to seeing oneself as the perpetual target, the individual loses the ability for self-assessment and responsibility. Any criticism is automatically dismissed as an attack, preventing personal growth and the correction of problematic behaviors. Michael Jackson became so immersed in his role as a martyr that it became almost impossible for him and for his devotees to consider the possibility that he could, in some respect, be wrong. The armor of the victim protected him, but it also blinded him. This complex dance between real victimization and strategic manipulation defines the final phase of his life. He was, without a doubt, a victim of the most predatory media that has ever existed and of a terrible childhood. However, he also learned to use this same victim identity to control narratives, influence public opinion, and defend himself against very serious accusations. The truth, as always, lies not in one extreme or the other, but in the uncomfortable and dark overlap between the martyr and the master, manipulator. The entire psychological architecture that Michael Jackson built throughout his life, the control, the persona, the isolation, the fantasy, was in essence an elaborate escape mechanism. An escape from the pain of trauma, the pressure of fame, and the fear of reality. However, when psychological defenses begin to fail, when paranoia becomes unbearable and reality invades the fortress, the individual seeks a more direct and potent escape route. It is here that chemical dependency emerges as the final and most tragic solution. The substances, especially the painkillers and sedatives he used, offered what he had always sought: control over his own sensations. If he could not silence the critical voices of the outside world, or the echoes of his past, in his mind, he could at least silence his own nervous system. The addiction was not an act of hedonism, but the last resort of a man desperate to anesthetize a psychological pain that had become chronic and unbearable. It was the continuation of his escape strategy, taken to its logical and fatal conclusion. Denial is the inseparable companion of addiction. To maintain the use of the substance, the individual and those around them must participate in a complex charade. The problem is minimized, justified as necessary for physical pain or for sleep, and the reality of the addiction is constantly denied. Michael Jackson's inner circle, composed of people whose livelihoods depended on him, became a system of enablers. They were accomplices, perhaps reluctantly, in the denial that allowed the death spiral to continue, because confronting the truth would mean risking the collapse of the entire empire. The quest for absolute control, which was the central theme of his life, culminated in the total loss of control. Addiction is the ultimate irony for the controlling mind. In an attempt to manage pain, fear, and anxiety, he handed over control of his biology and, ultimately, his life to chemical substances. The same perfectionism that led him to rehearse tirelessly and control every note of his songs prevented him from admitting the failure or weakness of being an addict, trapping him even further in the cycle of use and denial. The final price of escaping psychological pain was life itself. Michael Jackson's story is a dark and tragic case study on the limits of human resilience. It shows that talent, wealth, and global fame are not effective shields against unresolved fundamental trauma. His death was not an isolated accident, but the endpoint of a long journey of flight from himself, an odyssey of pain that began in his childhood and concluded in a quiet room, proving that you can build a fantasy kingdom, mesmerize the world, and rewrite your own face, but you can never truly escape the shadows within. The truth is rarely pure and never simple. Michael Jackson was a creator and a prisoner of his own myth. What can we learn from his life about the price of genius and the dark psychological tools we all use, in some way, to cope with our own pressures? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you want to continue exploring the hidden truths of the human mind, make sure to subscribe to The Truth, Dark Psychology, and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next.